Scotch whiskey, Japanese whiskey, Irish whiskey, American whiskey, Canadian whiskey, bourbon. These are all whiskeys, and while they all have many similarities, there are also differences as well. This is Kurt Sasek, president of Wine Taster's Choice, and we're going to talk about the different types of whiskey that your average consumer in the United States may encounter in stores or restaurants and so forth. I'm not going to go into too much detail about each one. I'm just going to give you an overview to help you for day-to-day use. Oh, and by the way, if you don't mind, please like and comment on the video. And if you like it, please share it. First, let's define exactly what whiskey is. All whiskey is a liquor distilled from a fermented grain mash, which may be malted or not. Various grains are used for different varieties and may include corn, barley, rye, or wheat. In some ways, all whiskeys are alike in that they are distilled beverages made from a combination of grains, water, and yeast, and most are aged in charred oak barrels. But then when you start breaking it down, there are differences between each type. Here's a quick tip on the spelling of the word whiskey, or whiskey without the E, if that causes you confusion. You may have seen the word whiskey spelled with or without the letter E after the letter K. If you're referring to whiskey from Canada, Scotland, or Japan, you drop the E. If you're referring to whiskey from the United States or Ireland, you use the E. The plural form for whiskey with an E is whiskeys. The plural form for whiskey without the E is whiskeys. Now, Irish whiskey and Scotch whiskey are the oldest styles of this particular spirit. Now, which was created first is a matter of debate, and it's a very good way to start an argument. Now, let's go through each whiskey. Again, I'm only touching on the basics of each one. Bourbon. Bourbon must be made in the United States, and it is often associated with Kentucky. It must be made from at least 51% corn. It must be aged for a minimum of 2 years and no more than 160 proof. American rye whiskey. American rye whiskey must be from the United States, similar to bourbon, but in the United States, it must be distilled from at least 51% rye, whereas bourbon is 51% corn. American rye whiskey must be distilled at no more than 160 proof, and rye whiskey that has been aged for at least 2 years and has not been blended with other spirits may be further designated as straight. As a side note, Canadian whiskey is often referred to as rye whiskey. So what is the taste difference between bourbon and rye whiskey? Considering the bourbon is made from 51% corn, that corn will bring a sweetness. Rye is known for imparting a more spicy character. Next is Irish whiskey. It must be made in Ireland. It must be fermented by an action of yeast. Must have a minimum alcoholic content of 40% by volume. It is typically triple distilled, and there are single malt and blended varieties available. Irish whiskey is typically fermented with barley, but oftentimes with Irish whiskey it is unmalted, whereas Scotch whiskey is often malted. And Irish whiskey is typically matured for a minimum of 3 years. Scotch must be from Scotland. It's typically distilled twice. There are single malt and blended varieties available. It's typically fermented with barley, and in the case of Scotch, that barley is often malted, whereas with Irish whiskey, it's often unmalted. And Scotch is matured to a minimum of 3 years in most cases. Canadian whiskey must be from Canada. You're probably picking up on this whole regional thing, right? If it's called Canadian whiskey, it must be from Canada, from Scotch, whatever. So, Canadian whiskey. Most are blends of whiskeys made from a single grain, principally corn and rye. They must be aged for at least 3 years, and the barrels do not have to be new oak or charred, which is contrary to some of the other whiskeys. Canadian whiskeys are typically lighter and smoother than some other whiskey styles. Canadian whiskey is often referred to as rye whiskey because historically much of the content was from rye. There is no requirement for rye to be used to make Canadian whiskey, and the labels Canadian whiskey, Canadian rye whiskey, and rye whiskey are all legally permitted regardless of the actual composition, provided the whiskeys possess the aroma, taste, and character generally attributed to Canadian whiskey. Japanese whiskey must be from Japan. Whiskey production in Japan began around 1870. I didn't know they were making it for that long. Japanese whiskey is more similar to Scotch whiskey than other styles. In fact, when they started making Japanese whiskey, they modeled their whiskey after Scotch. Here's a fun fact. A 50-year-old Yamazaki first edition Japanese whiskey sold for $343,000 US at an auction in Hong Kong. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't. And hey, if you like the video, please share it.